So I'm putting on a little bit of a different hat today, and I'm going back to what I used to do, which was research the customer service space. And what I want to do is take you guys through this learning journey that we've been on at CEB across the past 10 years to understand really what is the primary goal of customer service, what should we be focused on in the customer experience, the notion of customer centricity that we all want to talk about so often today and try to define it and understand it and demystify it. Hopefully we can bring a little bit of clarity to that. But what I want to do as we go through this journey, I want to start us in an interesting place to kind of give you a sense of, to Mike's point, what's that conventional view out there? What's been the belief out there for a long-standing period of time here? I'm going to start with a story. How many of you know this character? Anybody ever seen this guy before? Anybody? A couple of you. So let me tell you who this guy is. His name's Joshy. Joshy is a giraffe. You wouldn't know it by looking at Joshy. He looks more like a slipper with eyeballs, doesn't he? But Joshy is the best friend in the whole world to a 5-year-old boy from Orlando, Florida named Timmy Hearn. Now, Timmy went on vacation with his mother out in Amelia Island in Florida at the Ritz-Carlton there. Don't know if anybody's ever been there. Beautiful hotel, beautiful property. Timmy's dad was over on the West Coast at a conference, couldn't make it, so his mom and him and Joshy went on this great vacation for a full week. They played at the beach. They ate great food. They had fun on the hotel property. When all was said and done, they drove back to their home in Orlando, arrived about the same time that Dad got home from his conference on Sunday night, about 8 o'clock. Got Timmy inside, went to get him to bed. Timmy realized his best friend in the whole world, this slipper with eyeballs, was missing. Now, I don't know how many of you have kids at that age. I got a 2-year-old, and when his little monkey goes missing, we got real problems. Well, Timmy was not dissimilar. Timmy went apoplectic nuclear, couldn't believe his best friend in the whole world was gone. How's he going to go to bed without his best friend? So his parents do what any sane, normal, logical parents would do. His dad tells him a little white lie. Now, Timmy, don't worry about Joshy. Don't you think he deserves a couple extra days of vacation? I think he was having fun at the beach, don't you? Timmy says, yeah, I think you're right, Dad. Finally get him calmed down, get him put to bed. Mom quickly jumps on Amazon, starts searching feverishly to find another one of these slippers with eyeballs. And Dad goes and checks his voicemail real quick. He's got a couple voicemails. But one of the voicemails was the Ritz-Carlton. And it was their loss prevention team reaching out to say, hey, we found this slipper with eyeballs thing in the laundry from your room. Assume it belongs to you guys. What's the address? We'd love to send it back to you. So the dad calls back the Ritz-Carlton, talks to the loss prevention team there, and tells one of the managers what their address is, just assuming he's going to send it out overnight to them. And in the course of telling him the address, the dad just mentions a little white lie. And by the way, I was glad you called. Told my son it was going to be 3 days till he got home because he's on extended vacation. My wife is just going to buy a new one. We'd have it in time. Problem solved. And so the service manager, the loss prevention manager, hangs up the phone to the dad. And at this point, I think most of us would say if we were in the loss prevention manager's shoes, we'd probably throw the thing in a box and send it out. Maybe 2-day express. Maybe if we're feeling generous. Well, check out what the team at the Ritz-Carlton did. This is really cool. Just take that in for a minute. So there's our friend Joshy, hanging out poolside. I mean, he got his extended vacation plus, didn't he? In the upper right there he is with the requisite cucumbers over the eyes, getting that massage, hanging out with some new friends, playing golf beachside. I got to tell you, this slipper with eyeballs had a way better summer than I had last year. And isn't this a cool story? I mean, think about the thought that went into this. Think about that notion of providing that moment of wow, that moment of surprise for this family. And the fortunate part is Timmy's dad, Chris Hearn, is a blogger for the Huffington Post. You picked the right guy. And it's cool, right? We create this customer for life. That is the thought here. We go above and beyond to lock this customer in. He is going to be loyal to us forever and ever as a result of it. And they picked the right guy who actually went out there and blogged some great things. So it's a fantastic story. Now here's where things take an interesting turn is because the CEOs of the companies that I work with hear this story. They hear it from customers. They hear it from their teams. They start to ask themselves, well, why can't we aspire to that level of service in every single interaction that we have with our customers? And suddenly the VP of service comes to me and says, hey, how do I do this? How do we operationalize this notion of delight, this notion of surprise, this notion of wow? And as a research organization, we get all fired up and say, great, big, hairy problem. right? The notion of delight. We want to learn how to do it better. We couple that with the face of increasing commoditization amongst many different products and services out there, and we look at customer service as a true point of differentiation, an area where we can drive competitive advantage, capture market share, increase loyalty, increase customer retention, increase share of wallet, all the great things that come with it. So we get fired up as a research organization, and we go out and we start doing research. So we ask ourselves some hard questions. First, what impact do customer service interactions have on the customer, and namely customer loyalty? Does it matter at all? I mean, I think we all would agree it matters to a certain degree, but how much? And secondly, then what are the things we can do to drive positive gains in that customer loyalty? And finally, this is one that becomes very, very important for those leading service groups and those leading sales teams. How do we do this while still reducing operating costs? At least maintaining, if not reducing, right? Staying very diligent and focused on that bottom line, particularly through a cost center like the service channel for most organizations. So these are three very difficult questions that guided our research process. Now, all this sort of culminates in the book that Mike mentioned that we wrote last year, The Effortless Experience. Some of you may have seen it, some of you may not have. Wrote this book with Matt Dixon, who is also the co-author of the Challenger Sale. So we've had some fun with this. I'm going to try to tease this book apart and give you guys a sense of what the key findings are. I've only got a few minutes, so I'm not going to go into much detail here. If you do have questions on some of the implications and some of the more operational side of the book, I'm going to be around for a while. Happy to answer some questions there. So let's dig into the research, but first I'm going to baseline us. When we talk about loyalty, there's often this notion that loyalty is sort of this amorphous, soft, squishy idea out there. And no doubt it has a clear emotional side. There's clear emotional impact. There's also a very, very economic, sort of financial side to loyalty. So I want to define loyalty for us very carefully because we use this definition in all of our analysis. We're quite consistent with what this definition is. First, loyalty is not just purchase but repurchase, time and time again. And if we're doing our job and serving our customers well and selling to our customers well, then hopefully we're increasing that share of wallet. Okay? Now those two elements we call behavioral loyalty. I show you loyalty with my pocketbook. Right? The last one, we get into what we call attitudinal loyalty, a little bit more the softer side, but hopefully I say good things. I advocate. A lot of you will know Fred Reichheld and the great work he's done on the Net Promoter Score, for example, the likelihood to recommend your company to friends or colleagues. But hopefully our customers say good things and say fewer bad things about our company. And if we can optimize those three outcomes, I think we feel pretty good about it. Now, the place where loyalty is put to the test, however, the place where the stakes are the highest, is when things go wrong. And that's where our service channel comes into play. That's where those service interactions make a difference. These are those quote-unquote moments of truth. Something is not right. At the least, the customer has a question, if not a concern, if not a full-blown problem or a complaint. And so we have this fantastic little microcosm in the corporate world to isolate instances where those problems rear their ugly head and study that. And that is the contact centers, the service channels that we have out there. Okay? Chat, web, live phone, you name it. So that's what we did. We went out and we studied those spaces. Just to give you a sense of what we included in this group, and I'll kind of go through this quickly, 125,000 customer interactions, where we asked those customers, what happened? Tell us about it. What was the issue? What was the outcome? What happened through the course of the resolution? How many times did you have to contact this company? How many people did you speak with? How many times did you tell your story? This happened across both B2B and B2C. Just to give you a sense, a lot of you will be in the B2B space in this room. The sample set's about a third that comes from B2B. There are some interesting nuances and implications. I'll try to tease those out for us today. Okay? This is cross geo, outsource, in-house, you name it. It's all there. We also talked with 5,000 customer service reps. We surveyed them, we interviewed them, we did focus groups with them. We've done a lot of work to understand what do reps do? How are they supported? What is the climate and culture of the organization they sit in? I use that word climate very carefully because we were just talking about culture a minute ago, which is very difficult to change. Climate is something that is near in, something we can work on, we can change. There's a perception associated with it. I'll tell you a little bit about that in just a minute. Talked to over 100 companies. Now, to be clear, we serve about 700 different companies as part of the membership that I oversee. It gives us unprecedented access to all these executives, but when you can really sit down and have in-depth conversations around their operations, exposure to their teams, exposure to their systems, their processes, you learn a heck of a lot. That led us to 3 major findings. So that's all sort of the drum roll, please. Should we get to the findings? Finding number 1, that story about Joshi, what a great story, what a wonderful story. Problem is, what we found is that delight doesn't pay. What do I mean by that? Let me show you what we found in the data, and then I'll try to give you a sense of why we think we found that in the data. So if you guys can imagine for just a minute, you start to draw this graph in your own mind. If you think about the relationship, I'll move away so folks can see over here too. If you think about the relationship from a customer in terms of their loyalty, less loyal to more loyal on that y-axis. On the x-axis, below customer expectations, okay, we performed below those expectations. We simply met those expectations. We exceeded those expectations. Most of us are kind of thinking through how would we draw that relationship, and it probably looks something like this. Probably looks something like this. The notion that if we perform below customer expectations, well, you know what? They will be less loyal. They may leave our organization. They may say bad things. They certainly won't purchase again. If we meet those expectations, well, you know what? We get a nice little bump. It's very marginal, but there's some loyalty that is associated with meeting those expectations. But it's not until we push well out into this realm of exceeding their expectations do we see that dramatic hockey stick curve there, right? Going above and beyond those moments of surprise, those moments of wow. And while that seems right intuitively at some level, I want you to put yourself into a consumer mindset or into a business customer mindset. Don't be the executives, don't be the academics for a minute. Put yourselves into the mindset of it's 7 o'clock at night, dinner's waiting for you, you got a problem with your cell phone, you've called your telecom provider, and you're waiting on hold. What's going on in your head? What is the expectation you have going into that interaction? Kind of put that in the back of your mind. Hold on to that for a second here. I'm going to show you what we found in our data. So I'm going to ask you to revisit that thought. Here's what we found. Look how completely different those relationships are from what most of us would have thought that relationship should look like. What we see here is that certainly if we are below customer expectations, yes, indeed, they will punish us. We will have less loyalty from that particular customer if we don't meet those expectations. But what this shows us is that the greatest economic gain we have through the interactions is to simply meet those baseline customer expectations. Simply meeting those expectations gets us a nice, healthy boost in terms of that total loyalty. When we push out further into this realm of exceeding customer expectations, there's a little bit of benefit. There's a marginal benefit. For those in B2B space, we do see it's a little bit higher than in B2C, but again, very marginal. Now, for some, this is bad news. We look at this and we say, well, my intent, my mission in life to delight my customers, you've just sort of destroyed that. But there's sort of the glass half full view, which is we have the opportunity to get meeting expectations right far more often than we have the ability to delight customers. What we know from our data is that delight happens in those 125,000 interactions. Delight happened about 16% of the time. Okay, that's kind of a top two box definition of it. If I went to the top box, it's probably more like 2%. 16% of the time. So it turns out, I often say, a strategy of hope is probably more viable than a strategy of delight. The second thing we know about delight is that it costs more. You're looking at an increase on average of 10 to 20% in terms of the total operating costs, which for most of us who oversee the service channel probably makes us sick to think about the cost there. But you have added training, you have added time, you have added manual processes, you have added givebacks, discounts, expedited freight, you name it. There's all kinds of costs tied up in that particular equation there. So I think there's two key findings we need to take away from this page. First, we've probably overemphasized or overestimated the potency of exceeding customer expectations. And in many cases, we've underemphasized or underappreciated the notion of simply getting the basics right and simply meeting those customer expectations. Now let me give you two quick justifications for why we think this relationship exists. One is at far more of a psychological level. I'm going to turn to something that a lot of you, and at least half of you in this room as academics, will probably appreciate, and that's some academic lit. The other thing we're going to look at is the far more practical side, because there's a practical reality that when customers contact us in the service channel, they're starting from a suboptimal place already, and we have to take that into consideration. So this right here is for research geeks like myself and half the room who are academics are beach reading, is it not? This is the Social Psychological Personality Science issue from last month, May 2014. A couple professors, Neasy and Epley, out of the University of Chicago, my alma mater, and out of UC San Diego, behavioral scientists, behavioral sociologists, wanted to understand the relationship between promises being made and then those promises being kept, broken, or exceeded. And what started the whole research project is a really interesting story, but one of the authors She did a lot of business with a very prevalent online retailer, and it seemed that whenever they sent a note saying her package would arrive on a certain day, it always came a day earlier. And she thought, now, is that them being really clever? Is that a clever marketing scheme? Are they somehow making me more loyal because they exceed the expectation that they've set for me? And it spawned this research project where they went out and they did 3 different experiments as part of this particular paper. And they talked to students at both campuses and asked them about instances where an expectation was set. Somebody made a promise. Somebody fulfilled that promise. They didn't meet the promise. They broke the promise. They also created some scenarios where they had groups essentially make promises and either keep, break, or exceed those promises. What they found is this conclusion out of all this work. When the promisor expends extra effort in order to exceed the promises, their effort appears likely overlooked. What they concluded was that there is this asymmetry of response. An asymmetry of response simply means this. We as humans are less likely to give much credit for the upside. When you exceed, I give you a little bit of credit, but it's quite marginal. But when you fail to meet those expectations, when you fail to make that promise, or fail to keep that promise rather, I'm going to punish you tremendously. So there's this asymmetry of response. Very little on the upside, a lot on the negative side. So at a psychological level, we begin to understand and you think about yourselves and your own lives. Now let me get to the more practical side of it here, which takes us to our second key finding from our work. What we found is that customer service largely drives disloyalty. For every positive gain that we can drive in the service channel, we are 4 times more likely to drive disloyalty. 4 times more likely. Now, what exactly does this mean? How do I interpret this? Well, what I want you to do is just think for a minute about this notion of customer loyalty. And so many of us assume that customer loyalty has all these drivers that would go into a pie. If I put a pie up here that said customer loyalty, there's all these different drivers. There's brand, there's product, there's our sales channel, there's our service interactions. There's all these things that go into that pie. What I want you to do for a minute is separate that pie into both the upside of loyalty and the downside, disloyalty. If we look at just what drives the upside of loyalty, we find completely different drivers than what tend to drive the downside of disloyalty. Those upside drivers include things like the product. Does the product do what you said it would do? Does it live up to the expectations I had when I purchased the product? Does that product exceed those expectations? It does matter in that product realm. The brand. For those of you who know our Challenger research, will know a little bit around the sales force and the commercial conversations that we have with customers as a clear differentiator. Those things all contribute to positive gains in loyalty. On the disloyalty side, however, that is dominated, for better or for worse, it is dominated by customer service interactions. Because in the minds of most customers, when I have a product issue, it quickly becomes what? A service problem. And so in many cases, I'm a big football fan. It's kind of like we've been put back on the 1-yard line. And now we got to march 99 yards down the field. Okay? One executive looked at this and he said, the way I think about it, it's kind of like a sports analogy, Nick. He said, I think in customer service, we're trying to play offense far too often. What this tells me is we need to think better about defense. We need to think about this notion of disloyalty. And are we doing everything in our power to prevent and mitigate that disloyalty? I think it's a fantastic analogy. Let me show you exactly what drives this disloyalty so we can get on the path to knowing what we got to do about it. And then I'll pause and we'll hand it over to Roland in just a minute here. Drivers of disloyalty. I'm going to rattle through these pretty quickly. Things like repeat contacts. I had to contact you more than once. We know the notion of first contact resolution is a major metric out there. It's a major metric for a reason. It does matter. A lot of these things matter. And you're going to look at these things and say, yeah, I get it. We've seen all these individually out there, Nick. But I'm going to put a new lens on some of these as we work through what these drivers are. Things like channel switching. I start in one channel, the web, let's say, and I end up having to call you. I can tell you from our data, each time a customer switches channels, it's about a 10% decrease in their loyalty levels. Transfers, and closely associated repeating information. Right? I had to tell my story to multiple people, give them the context, tell them the situation, what's going on. Or just simply putting in account information. I put it in the phone tree, and I still have to tell the live rep. Why? Robotic service. Policies and processes that customers have to endure, and just simply the hassle factor that we put customers through. Now, when you step back at this, you look at any one of these individually, say, I got it, that makes sense. I would see that as a driver of disloyalty. I want you to step back and put this lens against it, though. This is customer effort. This is work we are putting on our customers' back to achieve and attain the resolution for a problem that, frankly, probably shouldn't have had in the first place. And we put customers through the gristmill, and man, are we good at it. I start with my sales rep. My sales rep can't quite handle the issue. I end up with some sort of service account manager. Service account manager can't quite handle the issue, ends up as a product issue. Talk to a product manager who has no customer-facing skills whatsoever. Try and help me resolve this issue. It ends up at some VP's level who finally does something that kind of tides me over, but I don't know that you actually fixed the issue in the first place. We still kind of have the issue. Right? And we all have these stories. You guys can probably think of them in your own lives, but this notion of customer effort. The right approach in the service channel is not a strategy of delighting that customer, going above and beyond. We simply do not get paid for it. The right approach is to mitigate disloyalty, play defense, ensure these things don't happen, and make it easy for customers to interact with us. I'm going to show you here the business case for customer effort. We went out there and we created this metric. Some of you may have heard of it, the customer effort score. And so we tracked that customer effort score against the loyalty outcomes I described to you earlier. And here's what you see. These data points are remarkable. Just to choose a couple of them. Increased spend or word of mouth. Look at those. 88% of customers who have a low effort experience indicate some degree of willingness to spend more versus 4% who have high effort experiences with us. What about negative word of mouth? This is an interesting one. 1% of customers having a low effort experience will go out there and gripe, and bitch, and complain on those very public and social forums that we all fear now, versus high effort, 81% of customers will go out there and say bad things when they have a high effort experience. 1 to 81. These are very stark data points. By the way, the interesting thing about negative word of mouth, when customers say positive things about our organization, it tends to be about the product. We've done the analysis across all the verbatims out there in social media. It tends to be about the product. People like to show off when they found a great product, as if I almost somehow get credit for recommending a great product or a great restaurant to you, my friends, or to you, social media. When we talk about the negative things a company does, it is almost exclusively service. And by the way, when people speak negatively, they tell far more people than when they speak positively about a company. So some real urgency to get behind this. To be clear, I put these data points up here very quickly, and I'm moving through this very quickly. As a researcher, you don't see data points this stark almost ever. Kind of forced us to question the math and question the relationships of customer effort to make sure that we weren't missing something. And lo and behold, they stick. Time and time again. I'm going to briefly walk through these because I don't want to eat into our time too much here. These are the 4 pillars. This is what we talk about through the course of the book. Channel stickiness. How do I get greater channel stickiness? If a customer starts in one channel, how do I make sure they don't have to switch to another channel? The punchline of the joke here is this. Our assumption is that we need to build out all these options where a customer can solve an infinite number of issues in an infinite number of channels. If they want to be skateboarding down the street wearing a virtual reality helmet and solve an issue, that way we will find the channel to help them do it. That is the wrong strategy. The companies that are winning in channel stickiness are the ones who are focused on ruthless simplicity. They're the companies that are doing things like guided resolution. They prompt the customer into the right channel. If you want a great example, go to Amazon's help site and click on and pretend you have a Kindle issue and click on the help menu through the Kindle issue. It'll prompt you through 3 questions asking you what your specific issue is. At the bottom of it, it'll spit out a recommendation saying, you can email us if you want. You can chat with us if you want. For this issue, just call us. And it's highlighted green. So it gives me some choice, but it tells me the best channel. I click call. I put my phone number in. They call within 0.6 seconds. And a rep says, Mr. Toman, I see you're having an issue with your Kindle HD hooking up to Wi-Fi. Let's get started right away. It's a remarkably clean experience. Okay? MasterCard.com is another great site focused on ruthless simplicity. A series of drop-down menus guide customers to the right channel. Next issue, avoidance. Don't just resolve the issue the customer stated. Resolve the next issue that is likely to happen for that customer. We know with a high degree of likelihood, by the way, ask some of your best service reps out there, why do customers call us back? And they'll tell you all these different reasons, remarkable reasons, but in many cases they'll highlight this idea of implicit issues, tangential issues, things that the customer could have never known were going to happen but did. Here's an example that we'll all probably be familiar with at some point in life. We probably didn't know what prorating was, and we probably had an issue with a bill, called the company, had that issue resolved, and they end up prorating a bill for the next billing cycle. Suddenly we get that bill and it's 1.5 times greater than what we thought it was going to be. Well, how is that? And I end up calling back. Companies like Bell Canada are doing really smart things to help prevent that callback by sending the customer an email right as that billing statement comes to say, hey, you're going to see a bill that's a little higher than you thought it was. Don't call us. It's okay. Here's why that's happening. Next issue, avoidance. Experience engineering. This goes beyond just the traditional soft skills of working with a customer, and I really appreciate some of the frameworks that we just saw around what those individual temperaments, mentalities are, and there's a whole school of thought as to how I work with an amiable, right, or how I work with an expressive individual that customer service folks are trained on, and that is certainly important, but that is not what we're talking about here. Experience engineering is the idea of using very deliberate and calculated language to present the customer with options when frankly they don't feel like they have any. In many cases, we got to give a suboptimal answer. The answer may be no. The answer may be, well, I can't put you on the flight tomorrow. But here's what I can do. And how I present that using some negotiation tactics such as anchoring, sequencing, advocacy, phrasing. These are very important and powerful tools that your front line can put into motion to help customers feel better about the answers they are getting. And finally, frontline control. This is one I love to soapbox on. I'm going to do a very quick run through on it. There's a lot to say here. It starts with the fact that in the service channel, if we think about our reps on the call center floors, if there is any environment in the corporate world that is less trusted than those folks, that has less compliance around them, that has any degree of governance that looks remotely different from what we've done there, boy, I'd be hard-pressed to find it. We have inhibited their ability to help customers. They are on the clock. They are bounded by metrics. It is a terrible environment for them to work in and exercise any degree of judgment. We need to see a shift to treating that service channel in those individuals helping our customers with increasingly complex issues, because the easy stuff goes to self-service, in a way they can exercise their judgment and creating more of a knowledge-working climate as opposed to a manufacturing floor that we've got right now in the service channel. So those are our 4 pillars. Here's our customer effort score. For those of you in the industries that are able to use it, feel free to use it. We put it out there for everybody to use it. It's a predictive indicator of disloyalty coming out of a single service transaction. Really powerful stuff here. So I've run a little bit over my time, so let me wrap. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Well, it's great to be here, and I think I was asked to be here to basically be a counterpoint to Nick and try to create some drama. But we're gonna share a train ride back to DC today, so I'll try not to be too adversarial. But I want to talk about open your eyes and see delight, which tells you, I think, what my perspective is going to be on this topic. But I'm going to be talking a little bit about what the academic literature has to say that can enlighten us on these aspects. My background, I was really one of the pioneers of customer delight, and stemming from the early 1990s, and have done a lot of work on customer satisfaction and delight. I have eight books on customer satisfaction and service. I've done extensive consulting with a number of big name companies, a few of which are listed here on this topic. So my purpose, first of all, I want to talk about what is customer delight. Nick talked about that a bit, and I want to give you my perspective on that. Second, is Nick Toman right about anything? And third, is delight a good goal? You heard one perspective. I think you'll hear a different perspective. So, first of all, see the light equals see delight? Well, okay, let's consider. Here's a situation that everybody really runs into in their daily life. You've got a light. You hope it turns on, right? Okay, you pull that little crank there, and you hope that the light comes on. Does that delight you? I don't think it probably delights you. We notice that there are many things where perfect satisfaction is not going to equal delight. You know, we expect the light to come on. For example, in my hotel this morning, I was up on the 6th floor, and I have my bags up there on the 6th floor, and the elevator's out of order. Okay, suddenly this is the light switch that doesn't work. You know, I'm going to be very upset about that. They simply didn't come through with what I wanted. So this is really playing into what Nick was talking about. That's a big dissatisfier. It wouldn't have delighted me if the elevator worked. I expected the elevator to work, but the elevator didn't work. Big dissatisfier. Here's a framework from the Japanese theorist Kano, who was really one of the first ones to talk about delight. And the axis here, this is didn't do it at all to did it very well on this axis. And then this is total dissatisfaction to total satisfaction on this end. Now, there are two parts of this diagram that I want you to look at. First of all, this is one kind of thing. This is like the light switch. This is like the elevator. If it doesn't work, you're going to be totally dissatisfied. If it does work, ho hum, I expected it to work. So you don't really get any points for it working. You just get hammered if it doesn't work. On the other hand, there's this other thing, which is this part here, and that's the potential delighters. That's where you don't really expect it. It's like the first anecdote that Nick gave, you know, the kangaroo. This is, you don't expect them to do all that, but if you actually provide that extra, then you actually create a level of delight that would not have existed otherwise. So these things are very different, and it's very helpful to think about the difference between basically dissatisfiers and delighters. They're quite different things. So what is delight? And I think Nick did a good job of talking about this. It's a surprising performance. It has to be surprising. And it has to create arousal. It can't be boring surprise. That doesn't work. There has to be arousal. Psychologically, we have demonstrated that. And there has to be pleasure from it. And if you have all those things, then what you have is a level of delight. So how can you measure delight? Well, you know, what most people are thinking about is let's take our satisfaction scale and we'll take the top box or the top two boxes and we'll call that delight. And that doesn't work. Think about the light bulb example. You know, if the light bulb doesn't come on, okay, you give it a 1 or whatever on the 10-point scale. If the light bulb does come on, you give it a 10. You know, what can it do? You can't do better than the light coming on. That's what you wanted. But that's not delight. Remember, when the light comes on, you totally expect it. It's not delight. So you can't just use the top box or the top two boxes and say that's measuring delight. It's not. So we have to have surprising. So here's one approach. And this is a scale that I've used. This is actually somewhat similar to some stuff that Nick was talking about. Worse than expected, about as expected, but I don't say better than expected. I say much better than expected. Because, you know, if you turn the light switch and the light switch comes on, that's about as expected. You're not going to greatly exceed somebody's expectation by having the light come on or having the elevator work. You need much better than expected. So the special stuff that happened with the kangaroo, that was much better than expected. So you can really measure delight for that. And Nick is right about something else, which is that the drivers of dissatisfaction are quite different from the drivers of delight. They're much different. You have to really manage those separately. So, for example, an accurate bill, okay, fine. You expect an accurate bill. That can produce satisfaction, but it can't produce delight. remembering my wife's name, that can produce delight, because that's probably something you didn't expect. Okay, now, what about that Toman guy? Stop trying to delight your customers. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure I can really go along with that so much. Is Nick Toman the Grinch?
This is going to be a great train ride.
So let's be nice. He's actually right about some things, as I see it. For example, solving problems is important, definitely. And here's something from psychology. This is actually a theoretical framework that was created by Kahneman and Tversky in 1979. And Danny Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for this work. And Tversky would have shared the Nobel Prize, except that he died before it was awarded. Let's take a look at this. This is losses versus gains on this side, and this is the value that's obtained from it on this side. And you can think of this point in the middle as being a reference point. You know, this is sort of what you expect. Okay? Now, what this diagram shows you is that if you're below expectations, what happens is that you pay a big penalty for that, just like Nick was talking about. And if you're on the plus side, you get a less of a reward comparatively. And the way this is talked about in psychology and in the fields that use this work, they say losses loom larger than gains. And that's absolutely true, and the academic literature supports this all over the place. So it is absolutely correct, and I want to support that idea. So problems hurt more than delight helps. That's true. So you need to fix the problems first. So you can't delight somebody if there are problems to begin with. So, oh, sorry, the car burst into flames, but have a free piece of cake. No, I don't think that's going to work. Better keep the car from bursting into flames. This is something that we need to worry about. We need to worry about solving the problems first, and after we have that all in order, then we can think about delighting the customer. Some more agreement with him. Satisfying customers can cost too much. This is a book that I wrote in the 1990s with Tony Zahorik and Tim Cunningham, and it's called Return on Quality. It was somewhat revolutionary at the time because what it said is you can satisfy your customers too much. So don't do that. You got to be able to worry about the return that you get on your investment. And we proposed some methods for doing that and applied it in a whole bunch of companies. So this is something that I definitely agree with Nick about, that we can spend too much. And we need to calculate ROI, and this is a cover story of Business Week that was based on the return on quality idea and our work. So this is something that's been, I think, known in the business world for some time. So yet more agreement, customer effort is important. And there's a lot of academic literature to support that. Convenience is very key. And that's a very important part of the work that Valerie Zeithamel and Kay Lemon and I have done, that creating convenience, making things easy is a very important thing. Len Berry and colleagues also have done a lot of work on convenience. So, for example, difficult websites. You know, he gave some online examples of things working or not working, but websites can be a big cause of effort. In particular, some work that I've done with Deborah Thompson and Rebecca Hamilton on feature fatigue shows that if things are too complicated for the customer, then you're going to get some really bad outcomes. And the problem for this is that the technical people, the web designers, the engineers, et cetera, always want to add features. They want to add features, they want to add capabilities because they can. And that's what an engineer does. And the more complicated it gets, the harder it is to deal with. And this was something that we published in Harvard Business Review and also in the Journal of Marketing Research. And what we found was that this resonated with a lot of people. And in fact, it didn't just resonate with people who are doing marketing and sales, it resonated with engineers. So for example, one of the organizations that invited me in to talk to them was NASA, the space agency, because they were worried about the stuff that their astronauts were using were too complicated. And so this is something that is really important, is keeping things simple, keeping things less effortful. Okay, now for the disagreements. I guess I should have put the Rangers up there, right? That's what I should have done. But by the way, the Rangers going to survive? I don't know. Anybody here from New York? Okay. Well, they survived longer than Washington Capitals, I can tell you that for sure. Okay. So customer satisfaction isn't important. That's definitely not true. Okay. There's a huge academic literature. This is just a small sample that basically demonstrates the extreme importance of customer satisfaction and delight. Anybody like Fred Reichheld who says customer satisfaction isn't important, forget it. That has been shown in the academic literature for sure. But one thing that we do know is that sometimes there isn't a huge relationship between customer satisfaction and loyalty. And that was Reichheld's big point. But I would contend that he really did that to try to sell the Net Promoter Score. And by the way, the Net Promoter Score has been pretty much completely debunked in the academic literature. It's been trashed. There's been a series of articles that basically showed that Net Promoter Score isn't any better than any one of a bunch of other possible measures, including customer satisfaction. And I'm not against the idea of companies using Net Promoter Score because it's better than nothing, but it isn't better than a whole lot of things that people have used for years. Okay, why do we have a low correlation between customer satisfaction and loyalty? Well, one reason is switching costs. If there are high switching costs, then you can be dissatisfied and not leave. An example of this is, how many of you use Microsoft Office? Let's see a show of hands. Okay, how many of you really think it's great? Okay, there you go. But they managed to really create the switching costs that made it very difficult for people to leave Microsoft Office. I mean, everybody's got Microsoft Office. People use PowerPoint, people use Microsoft Word, et cetera. You can share the files. Everybody knows how to do that. After a while, you get network effects, which means that you're using PowerPoint is useful because everybody else is using PowerPoint. So switching costs are a big aspect here. Another thing that's going on is comparison with competitors. We can satisfy our customer, but if our competitor is better, they're still going to leave. So that's what we have to worry about. You almost always have to be concerned about how your scores compare to competitors' scores. Your scores in isolation are not really useful. You have to take a look at how you're doing compared to your competition, because that's what's going to determine whether somebody stays with you or not. Now, another interesting thing about customer satisfaction is it's generally speaking not correlated with market share. And that's weird, right? Because you think satisfying customers is kind of a good thing. So why isn't it correlated with market share, or often it's negatively correlated with market share. In fact, the usual case is it's negatively correlated. So how can that be? Well, the reason that happens is that one way you get big in market share is you get a whole bunch of marginal customers to join you. You know, the niche players always have the customers that are perfect for them. That's because they're in that niche and their customers are in that niche. But to be able to get a really big market share, you have to get people who are sort of lukewarm about you. Otherwise, you're not going to get big. So if you get those marginal customers, they're not as happy, they're not as loyal, etc. So that's why you see this negative correlation. Whereas if you take a look at this customer by customer, you satisfy a particular customer more, their loyalty will go up. I guarantee that. The literature shows that clearly. So don't be dissuaded about customer satisfaction based on aggregate measures. It's not enough. So satisfaction definitely does drive loyalty. That's been demonstrated. And comparison with competitors matter, and switching costs matter. So back to the disagreements. Delight is a waste of money. I disagree. Now, again, you can spend too much, but we actually know that if we delight the customer, there are benefits other than just loyalty or immediate customer satisfaction of your own customers. One thing that's bad about delight is that if you delight a customer, now they expect it, right? So you have the problem of raising their expectations. So now it's harder to satisfy them in the future. And but what our research shows, Rich Oliver and myself, is that if you delight the customer, there's a secondary benefit. And the secondary benefit is that now you've raised the expectations for your competitors' customers. And now your competitor's customers are going to be more dissatisfied with your competitor. You know, so if a company does better than its competitors, you're not just talking about the satisfaction levels for your own customers, you're talking about the satisfaction levels for your competitors' customers too. And they can leave the competitor because they're dissatisfied now and come to you. So one thing that is implied by Nick's point of view is that we can solve problems and keep things simple by creating more self-service opportunities. And I disagree that that's always a good idea. For example, there's a lot of research that shows that there's a trade-off between productivity and customer satisfaction, especially in the service sector. And this goes all the way back to some work that Gene Anderson and Claes Fornell and I did in Sweden in the 1990s. And recent work by Minghui Huang and myself shows that in the service sector, there is this trade-off between productivity and customer satisfaction. And this is, by the way, different from the goods sector. In the goods sector, you can generate productivity and customer satisfaction at the same time, because in the goods sector, you're trying to make everything the same. You know, if you got something coming down an assembly line, you want every part to be the same, right? It's got to be exactly the same, otherwise it's not good. Now, think about what it's like in service. You know, if you're in a service situation and you're dealing with a customer, every customer is different. Suddenly, the key to quality isn't making everything the same, it's making everything different. You know, every customer that comes along has to be treated in a different way. And so the problem is that this takes away the economies of scale that come from standardization. So if you're going to try to delight the customer, that's that involves additional effort, typically. So we want to be dealing with an optimal level of service productivity. Not too much, not too little. And beyond that point, it's less profitable. And our research over hundreds of companies shows that this is true. And there are many bad examples. For example, the phone menus we're all dealing with, those are examples where service has actually gotten worse. And sure, it costs less, it's more productive, it's more efficient, but it's worse. So you've actually made the customer experience worse than it was. So some keys for customer delight. First of all, fix your problems first. You can't delight the customer if you haven't fixed the problems. Second of all, surprise the customer. Surprise is the key. Don't spend too much. Otherwise, you're not going to get your return on investment from customer delight. And the personal touch is the easiest way to get this done. You know, if you can do something interpersonally to delight the customer, that is usually the approach that is the most efficient in terms of cost, at the same time producing the results that you want from the customer. So in conclusion, first of all, delighting the customer does work. Second of all, satisfying the customer and delighting the customer are really different things. And third, comparison with the competitors is key. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Roland. So what I'd like to do at this point is bring the two gentlemen up to the front, and Jeff will have a chair up front. I'd also at this point like to, so Roland, if you could sit down, I'd like to give Nick a chance to react on a couple of issues. First, Nick, I'd like to ask you a question about Roland's positioning of the concept of delight as not on the satisfaction scale, but different than satisfaction. What are some of your takes on that? And of course, you could holistically anything that you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, so I think how to think about measuring the notion of delight, I think it was a fantastic way to think about it. I think the bar is very high in terms of what delight is. I like his accentuated scale, and if I thought about putting a metric in place around it, I think it's a great scale to put in place. I think the challenge is when you drive into sort of operational execution around some of these elements. And I think on the surface, just to give a generic or sort of general response, I think I wouldn't disagree that delight's not a bad thing. In fact, we had a lot of debates internally when we first found our data. What exactly is this data telling us? Does it say delight's a bad thing? Now, in so much as a lot of you will wear the head of being an executive and being mindful of cost to your company, from a bottom line standpoint, you could argue maybe it's a bad thing. Maybe we are over-delivering commensurate to the return that we would see on that from a cost standpoint. But I don't think delight on the surface is a bad thing, and particularly your point around the interpersonal side of it. If I can have a great exchange with someone, amen. The more power to you to do that. But I think where you get into some interesting points of distinction in the work is around the operational side of it. What do we put into motion from an economies of scale standpoint, from a strategy standpoint? When we tell our front line, you need to be delighting versus you need to make this a lot easier. What's the more tactical view that they're going to take when you say delight? The interpretation is difficult. The possibilities are endless. Ease, well, ask any rep how you can make it easier, and they're going to give you 12 things right now. So the notion of fix the problems first. I think we have a lot of problems to fix before we earn the right to truly be delight first and foremost as a strategy. So that's kind of my general point of view there.
Yeah, well, Roland, that leads me to a question for you. One of the challenges that Nick brought up early on in his presentation is if you look at that scale of satisfaction, that across those thousands of instances, very few people are at the very top of that satisfaction scale. And my question to you is, if you're talking about exceeding, does a person, in order to be delighted, already have to be, if they're independent, at the top of that satisfaction scale and then be delighted? Or are they two completely separate factors? Can you be at the middle or bottom of a satisfaction scale and yet be delighted?
Yeah, I would say that being at the top of the satisfaction scale is a necessary but not sufficient condition for delight. You can be at 7 on a 7-point scale and not be delighted. So it's really something above and beyond. You have to have surprising, arousing, exceeding expectations to get to the delight. So it's something that really needs to be measured separately in some way.
So in following up on that question, would you disagree then with Nick on the fact that the vast majority of your effort should be focused on being able to maintain that satisfaction? And in those, and what percentage of those cases were the very top box in the scales that you were saying, Nick?
We found 16% in our survey.
16%, those are the opportunities for delight. Would you say that so you have the vast majority of your effort would be to bring up that satisfaction and less effort on the delight side? I'm just questioning that.
There's a lot of variability across industries. Actually, with customer satisfaction scores that I'm familiar with, very often the scores skew quite high. It's not unusual for somebody to say, hey, we satisfy 90 to 95% of our customers if it's defined as something like 8 on a 10-point scale. So a lot of companies have gotten to that level, and if they haven't gotten to that level, it's a problem because people tend to grade high on customer satisfaction scale. So if you're not at the top of the scale, that's really bad news.
Okay. I'd like to then open to some questions.
So this reminds me of the old book on value, discipline, choices, being operationally excellent or innovator or customer intimate. If you applied this, say, to the hotel industry, Holiday Inn is, to me, operationally excellent. Their website's fantastic, easy to use. Hilton or Marriott maybe choose to be an innovator, and Hyatt actually has somebody answer the phone right away, and you don't go through any menus, at least that's what I recall. So isn't it about you can choose to operate in one of those value disciplines and make it work profitably for your company? Do you have to be one or the other, I think is what you're...
Who are you directing that question to first? Nick?
To both.
Yes.
Oh, both. Okay.
I'll take a quick shot at it. And I think there's a big brand implication here. You got to ask yourselves. One of the things that we focus pretty ruthlessly on is helping companies really think through, is the brand expectation, is the reputation one of delight? And I told the Ritz-Carlton story. Interestingly enough, I told that story yesterday. Ritz-Carlton was in the room. Kind of interesting to get their perspective. But Ritz-Carlton certainly has put out there, ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. We are a delight brand. Interestingly enough, I've shared the story. I don't know if anybody here from Disney, any Disney folks in the house? Always check before we talk. But interestingly enough, I've had the opportunity to share this with Disney, and Disney would actually tell you we are not about delight as a brand necessarily. Delight is a very careful and tricky place for us to be as a brand. Now, we are about service execution at a very, very high level, hence the Disney Institute and all the things that Disney now has taught a lot of us around operational execution. Do they look for moments when they can, interpersonal moments? You bet they do. Has it been a cornerstone of the strategy? Would you go to a senior officer and ask for money to fund a delight initiative? Probably not. They have a certain degree of fiscal conservatism that would inhibit that, whereas Ritz-Carlton would actually say this might be an investment worth making for brand reasons. So I do think there's a declaration that we have to be very honest with ourselves with what is the brand presence we have, and do we have a brand that we would certainly classify as a delighter? Zappos is a company a lot of you will know in the service circles, gotten to know them quite well, as you can imagine. We've had some fun and interesting counterpoints with Zappos. Zappos would tell you that actually we do want to be known as a delighter in the space, and we are willing to let customers call in for 9 hours and talk to a rep if that's what they want to do, and we've all heard that story. At the end of the day, though, it's interesting because you look at what they're really doing, and I would argue Zappos has made the easiest service interaction, the easiest buying interaction of any online retailer you will find out there. I mentioned Amazon earlier. Zappos, obviously an Amazon company. Zappos takes it to a whole new level. And if you haven't had an interaction with them, the reality is, when have you ever had to call Zappos? It is flawless execution on the or on the web platform, on the ordering process, on the explanation of the product. I'm trying to determine what's going to fit me. I'm buying a shoe for goodness sake. What's going to fit me? What's the comfort level? It's a remarkable experience. So I think there's a fair question there. What is the strategy for most of us? I think if we answer that candidly, we probably would say, look, we are about operational efficiency. We are about sound execution. We are not necessarily a delight brand.
Roland, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say it's really a matter of where you are evolutionarily. How far has your company evolved? The first thing that needs to be done is the company needs to be a satisfier. It needs to solve its problems. Companies that have gotten to that point, then they can think about being delighters.
Our owner wrote a book called Customers for Life that is often confused for a book about customer delight versus operational excellence. So our company is very much into this notion of how we delight people, but we have a firm understanding until you've done what we're supposed to do consistently every single time, going that extra step doesn't mean much. So I totally agree with you there. But the thing I want to ask both of you to consider, or have you considered, is the effect of the stories of delight on the culture of the organization. One of the hallmarks of our company is a very strong culture about how we serve the customer, but that is really manifested through these stories of delight. And when they get shared throughout the organization, they actually give permission for other people to act in a similar way.
Yeah, that's a very good point. A key concept in all this is empowerment. The employees need to feel as though they're empowered to be able to delight the customer. And these kinds of stories create the culture that permit that empowerment.
Great.
And just very briefly, I would actually agree with that. There's no reason not to have the wall of fame. What's interesting, I actually was talking with one CFO one day. It was really funny because he called me back later and he said, Nick, I got to tell you, an interesting thing occurred. He said, I went down to our wall of fame, I read through it, and I actually grabbed one of our analysts, and I actually asked him, I want you to look at those customer letters, and I want you to tell me, what's the account look like right now? Because he listened to the conversation that we had. Interestingly enough, he came back, and we had a conversation just about this, because what he found was that, in fact, the majority of those letters that were up, and this was just for a couple months of letters and emails that they had gotten, and it wasn't the annals of history, so it's not a huge sample, but he said actually 54% of those customers were no longer customers. And so he said, what your research is signaling to me is that they will give us praise, they will give us a story. He said, I'm not, in no way, shape, or form do I want to take those stories down because it is important that we be aspired to a certain level of a service standard here. But what he told me, and I thought was very telling, and I think it's kind of an interesting and an implicit lesson in a lot of this, is keeping the team focused. He said, I want to take and really try to dial into these ease stories where we made it easier for the customer, we made it more convenient for the customer. We took the work off of their plate. Now, if you want to call them delight or not, he said, Nick, we can have that debate, doesn't matter. But he said, I like the idea of ease because my people can get it. When I tell them delight, it's an infinitude of potential options. How do I do it? When do I do it? What way do I do it? How do we coach to it? I can't really tell you those things because you got to look for the opportunity. But where we can look at the things we know drive the customer nuts and try to suppress, mitigate, transfer the work back onto ourselves, those are the moments I want to look for. So in my mind, it's call it nuance, call it a careful distinction, but I think it's an important one.
Great. We have a question back. Go ahead.
So just going back to the Ritz-Carlton story, this is probably a question for both of you, but maybe directed at Nick first. It doesn't sound like in that situation that somebody forwarded that to the delight department for consideration, like should we or should we not delight in this circumstance. You had a team member, and I think it ties to Joe's point about culture too, you had a team member who in that moment decided there was an opportunity to kind of go above and beyond. And I guess I'm interested, because we're kind of talking about two extremes, right? Delight or don't delight, and nobody's saying delight's bad. But I'm interested in your guys' perspective on, and even interested to see if anything teased out in the 16% where delight occurred, where it's worth it, where doing it on a more situational basis under a certain set of circumstances where delight may be very appropriate, as opposed to orienting your entire service strategy around the notion of delight. So thoughts on that?
I'll field that quickly and be curious for Roland's take. But so Brady, obviously know your company well. What's interesting is in our data, going back to our data, if you remember the curve I showed you, the flattening, diminishing return on that, there still is a marginal uptick associated with delight. When it does happen, there is a marginal loyalty uptick. What we find is that it's a bit more pronounced in a couple different spaces. One space where it's a little bit more pronounced is in financial services at an industry level. The other space is generally across B2B. I mentioned that in our conversation. Most of you who are in the industry here today are representing B2B organizations. In B2B, so I'll center on that story for a minute. In B2B, what we found are some very specific points of delight that actually do have a nice uptick. One of them, for those who know our work on Challenger, this won't be terribly surprising, but is in that service interaction, I taught the customer something they didn't know about their business. I showed them a better way to handle something, to think about something. So Brady, obviously the number of transactions you have with any given customer in the MRO space, I mean, there's just thousands and thousands, but to help them think a little bit differently, whether there's somebody running a facility or whether they're a CFO, the Al or Bettys of the world. And so we have opportunities to engage that customer in a conversation that helps enlighten them as to what they can do differently in their business, in their workflow, in their organization through the service channel. Now, a lot of you who know Challenger will know the sales force is the ones we've largely looked at to do that, to push and challenge a customer to think differently about their business. And that is a moment of surprise. It is unexpected, but I would argue you can do the same thing, and our data shows us teaching the customer is the biggest incremental loyalty booster when you do have delight that occurs. Now again, that's a bit more exceptional in service, and so we got to be mindful of bottom line versus those opportunities, but that is a very specific instance that applies to most of you.
Roland, I just wanted to touch because I guess the 16% factor that you would say, I guess Roland's point would be is that 16% is just those people experienced perfect operational efficiency. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, I want to talk about the difference between satisfying a customer and delighting a customer and how you manage them, because you manage them differently. We were talking about they have different drivers. You have to manage them differently. Like for customer satisfaction, when you're talking about solving problems or preventing problems, you're talking about standardization. Make it the same every time. Don't screw up. That's what satisfaction is about. So that's where the training has to be. Do it right. Do it this way. Do it exactly like this. Standardize it every time. Make it perfect. So that's when you get the operational stuff right. Now, when you go to managing delight, it's the opposite. When you're managing customer delight, you have to be thinking, I'm going to be an improviser. I'm going to be a jazz musician. I'm going to be somebody who reacts to the customer. And that's very different. And the way I like to talk about it is, it's a difference between a role and a script. If you're an actor and you're in a movie or a play, often they'll give you words to say, and you're supposed to say exactly those words. That's like how you act if you're trying to satisfy. But if you are thinking more broadly, if you're in an improvisational situation, that's very different. You have to react to what the other person does. This is like an improv comedy thing, where you're trying to figure out how the customer is acting, and then you respond appropriately in a way that you may not have trained for before. So that's where the empowerment thing comes in. If your frontline personnel are not trained to be improvisational, if they're not empowered, they're never going to be able to delight the customer interpersonally. It's never going to happen. It's like you go into McDonald's, they're not going to know what to do because they're supposed to say certain words and that's that. But in a situation where you're trying to delight the customer, they've got to get away from the script. They've got to think about their role, and their role has to vary according to what the customer does.
Okay. Let's go to Jan. You had a question here.
Maybe one remark. To be honest, I don't know who else, but I was not delighted so far by the input of Nick. Two reasons. I'm just being the devil's advocate, no problem. There was something to like. But my thought is that this flattening curve that you try to sell us has two problems. From the research side, I strongly doubt that you measure delight in the way that Roland just showed us you should do it. If you haven't, then you can't be valid with that. And the second is, from the managerial side, isn't it a matter of industry which you try to tackle and your business model? Isn't it depending on the business model you have? If you're trying to differentiate, then you may have another curve, whereas in industries where you have a strong cost focus, you get maybe your curve.
So
these two
let me
things-
recast that question. So you have it's twofold. The first question, I guess, Nick, is do you believe that the viewpoint that you've had of looking at the very top boxes, how does that contrast to the way of metric that Roland's brought? And secondly, does that hold across industry?
Yep. So two quick thoughts. One, from a purely methodological standpoint, the way that we looked at delight was relative to expectation, similar to what Roland had. So if you remember, it was below, meets, exceeds. We drove exceeds out into a very strongly exceeded to a realm of fell far below. I can't remember the precise 7-point scale that we had. Methodologically speaking, if I'm going to create a metric around that and I use Roland's, very much, what was it, very much exceeded?
Yeah, much better than expected.
Much better than expected. You start to get really small sample sizes there. So where we were at with that, we felt pretty good about it. And if you look at the typical distribution, it's good for a statistical perspective to look at it. That's what holds in terms of the analysis. Now, if I pushed it way out, would we see it spike a little bit higher? Maybe, maybe not. It's probably hard to measure. So I will leave that there. The thing I'll come back to, though, is your second point around when you look at the industry you're in and the certain set of expectations, and a lot of you are probably in highly competitive industries where we're probably not looking at a lot of entrepreneurs in the room who have explosive growth paths that they're riding right now with 20, 30, 40% growth in your business. And when you're in fairly mature markets, the notion of commoditization becomes very real. I spend the bulk of my life researching what differentiates companies at a company level. Okay, this service research is at sort of a transactional level, but let's back up to what differentiates companies at the broadest level. And what we know from our research, and we've done extensive research around customer loyalty and what truly differentiates, is when you look at the differentiation that is accrued from the products, does the product live up to the expectations, and do the services that accompany that product live up to the expectations set with the customer? How much differentiation do customers see there? What we find is that that accounts for about 19% of customer loyalty, okay? So the products and the services. The next tranche, if you will, of what matters in terms of loyalty is the brand and its reputation in the market, okay? So what's our brand? What's the reputation that it carries in the marketplace? We find another 19%. So a net of 38% of total loyalty contribution is associated with the products, the services, and the brand. Now, show that to a CMO, and they're going to die. Literally. You're telling me that the core trinity of what drives loyalty, our products, our services, and our brand accounts for 38% of customer loyalty. You've got to be kidding me. There has to be a flaw in that data. There's no flaw in that data. What we find is that those have become very much so table stakes in the market. You have to have good brands. You have to have good products. You have to have good services. Now, if I told you two examples that we were talking about earlier with the talk prior to us, GE and Siemens. Well, none of us would dispute that GE has a great brand. They have great services. They have great products. Now let's compare them to Siemens. Who wins? I don't know. Who's cheaper? And so what we find is that increasingly in the eyes of customers, it is more and more difficult for them to differentiate you from the competition. In fact, they have every motivation to not differentiate you because if they don't differentiate you, they can command a price premium. And so what we find is we see the differences. We live those differences. We're very clear on those differences. Where we see the biggest differentiation, if that's only 38% of the loyalty equation, where we see the greatest differentiation is in how we engage the customers in a dialogue about our company, and more importantly, about how our company can help their companies in ways that they hadn't understood, ways they hadn't appreciated, in ways that help their company do things, manage risk better, make more money, manage costs better. If we can help them understand ways to do that that aren't us talking about our capabilities, but talking about their performance, how they can improve, that lead back to our company, that is where we see the greatest differentiation. In fact, 53% of total loyalty is explained by how we help customers manage their business better. Now, you can argue that is that delight or not. I would actually say, yeah, it is. And it's on that positive side of loyalty that we talked about, not in the service channel. In the service channel, they are table stakes. And that right now, what we find is they will not pay you for that. It is table stakes. In fact, increasingly, they don't want to see those differences because it means I have to pay you more.
Roland, would you like last 30 seconds to minute final thought on this before we close?
Well, yes. I mean, one of the big things that's important is getting beyond the table stakes, and that's what delight is about. You know, it's the only way to get beyond the table stakes, because everybody expects you to do your job. And once you get to the point where the competitors are all doing their job, the only differentiator you have is delight.
Great. All right, round of applause for our two.
Thank you both.